that's where we left half an hour ago, 1 hour ago. That there are a couple of ways by which Google is exposed its APIs. There are plugins, there are client libraries, there are app scripts. I'm going to talk about each of these things in somewhat detail towards the end of the session. What we're going to concentrate in this session is the tools that Google has provided for trying out and experimenting with APIs. So there is an API Explorer where all the APIs can be listed down or can be seen listed down, and you can actually try them out. You can try even the authentication out over there. Then there is an OAuth 2 playground. I'm going to come to what an OAuth is for those who don't know. There is a playground which will help you to try authentication with dummy users with dummy applications. And then there is an API console, which is a single place where all the applications that you have developed, you manage them, you register them, you take permissions from the users for accessing their data and so on. So just a quick recap, what are we going to learn today? We are going to talk about steps to build an application using Google APIs. We are not going to talk anything fancy, something totally basic but something totally very useful. So how to search, sign up and use Google APIs. How to make API calls using REST. I'm sure you all are aware of what is REST, and all Google APIs are best over REST. So we'll talk about how to make API calls using REST, and also towards the end using client libraries. We'll talk about how to make authenticated calls and how to make unauthenticated calls. So for example, if you want to call something that doesn't need user data, you can just do an unauthenticated call. If you want specifically to access, say, user's D+ profile or user's videos or something, you need to make an authenticated call. We'll also talk about how to access information on behalf of your users, how to ask permissions to them, and how to access the data specific to the user. And we'll talk about how to manage the access, the quota to your application, and the traffic to your application. And finally, we'll learn about the API Explorer and Playground. We'll actually play with it. Okay, so if there is one thing that you should take away from this session, then it is this slide. I'm okay if you forget everything else but not this slide. And this slide says that Google APIs are RESTful and they are built over the HTTP protocol. So if you understand this material, understand thoroughly well, then it will be very easy for you to try out APIs even if the documentation is incomplete or even if there are stuff that are not so easy to understand with. So what do we mean by there are REST APIs? Number one, the methods are HTTP verbs. So every API that you are going to do an access, you're going to say either a get or a put or a post or a delete. So they are all HTTP verbs. The resources that are passed across will be encoded in JavaScript object notation or JSON format. So for example, if you want to fetch some profile of a user or a Gmail inbox, all this information will come to you in form of JSON. Why JSON? Because it is easy for humans to read, it's very easy for machines to parse. It's an well agreed standard. And the third thing, all these requests go to Google developers front end, which is https www.googleapis.com. So only three things we need to remember. The methods are HTTP verbs, the resources are encoded in JSON, and all the requests must go to googleapis.com. So here is a quick example. There is a GET request, and as you can see, it is a GET to HTTPS www.googleapis.com. After that, what comes is the actual API, URL shortener. This API is nothing but it takes a long URL and converts it to a short URL, or takes a short URL and tells which long URL it was representing. So then comes the API, then comes the version of the API, and then comes the resource that we are going to access URL resource for URL shortener method. And how do we access? We are going to access using HTTP method GET, and therefore whatever parameters are there, we are going to put them in the URL, not in the body. So the parameters say short URL, so I am actually giving a short URL, which is this. This is everything that you need to call for converting a short URL to a long URL. And the interesting thing is that this is a purely HTTP URL, so I can actually go and plug it in network. Okay, once the network is up, I'll explain how this.
There are different servers, so we have another network. Speaker. The network is called Speaker.
Just find out. Okay.
Speaker is the network, and the password is GDaySPK.
Yeah, got it. Can I project this? Okay, so here was the request that was sent. You can see that the request is exactly what I copied and pasted, and here is the response that I get. This is a response in JSON format. There is a kind which tells you what resource you were looking for. It tells you what ID you sent as the short URL. It also tells you what long URL it is associated with, and finally the HTTP status, the status of the response. Here is another example. Instead of get, if you decide to do a post request, I of course can't do in the browser, I can use curl instead. Here is what I am going to do. Same API, URL shortener, version 1, same resource, but now I am going to pass a long URL, and I would expect that a corresponding short URL comes up. So I am going to copy this. Go to the command line, paste it. Yes. So it's a simple curl request that I've sent on the terminal. It says that I have done a request to URL shortener. This was the long URL that I took, and this was the short URL that was returned. So all Google APIs can be executed exactly like this. Things become a little bit complex when authentication comes. I'm going to talk about it in sufficient details a moment later. But in general, this is how all Google APIs typically work. These are all public APIs, yeah. So you can, if you have laptop or cell phone, you can try this out just now and they'll work. Okay, so let's move ahead. So now first thing, we all know how to access APIs or how to make API calls. Now the second obvious thing that needs to be answered is, where are all these APIs present? I am here, I told you URL shortener is a name of an API, that's why you were able to do the request. How do you find what all APIs are there for Hangouts, for Maps, for Gmails, and so on? So this is the place which should be your first landing spot for asking everything related to APIs that developers use. Developers.google.com is the central location for learning about tools, products, and services provided by Google. Also a place for referencing the API documentation. Every API is documented in sufficient details along with examples and a demo screen where you can try those APIs out on this site. So it's a place to study about, learn about referencing the API documentation, to explore the API semantics, methods, resources, what parameters are there, how does a response come, how does it look like, and so on. It's also a place for trying out APIs. It's not just a theory related page. You can actually try out all the APIs, see how the request and response get translated. And finally, it's a place for getting updates on the developer events, Hangouts, latest features. It's also a place where if you build a cool app, then Google can showcase it and advertise you, as I can show it over here. So let's go to this site, developers.google.com. Yes, there is a limit, I am coming to that, but there is a limit for every API regarding how many number of requests you can do as a free user and how many requests can you do as a paid user. Okay. So here is an example. This is how developers.google.com looks like. There is home, products, event, showcase. This is a place where all cool APIs, if you develop, we will be more than happy to showcase your applications over here. So some of the applications that we saw in the demos today were actually taken from this. And then there is a live tab where you can see what Google engineers are doing currently and how they can be reached, how you can ask your API specific questions or functionality specific questions directly to the user. So for example, if you have a question with Maps APIs, the correct person to answer this is the person who wrote that code, and those people will be available in certain office hours. You can see that more information on the live tab over there. What is more interesting over here is on the top there is a search box, and we are a search company to start with, and therefore it's no wonder if this box works. So let's have a quick demo to find out how do I search for Google Plus APIs. So first question, are there APIs for Google Plus? And if there are, of course, there is a separate session on Google Plus APIs after this where we'll go through lots of details. But if you just want to start with and want to know, are there APIs for Google Plus? This is what you will do, Google Plus APIs. Well, in the first result will typically take you to the Google Plus APIs. Your quota question gets answered over here. The API link tells you how to access this API. For example, look at this. API is nothing but a simple GET request to /plus API v1 version and people resource for finding people, and then there is an activities resource and comments resource and all that. All these parameters, information, how the data will look like, what exactly JSON format is and how does it look like, all this information is presented over here. So we are going to do a small exercise that will help us to strengthen our understanding of these APIs. The question is, find out if Google has an API to fetch Google profile of a user, and if so, use the API to fetch the profile of Harry Potter. So let's go to developers.google.com and we'll search about Google Plus APIs that we have already done on the top. If you see on the, so let's search, I think it's already, Google Plus APIs are available. If you look in the left pane, you can see there are a couple of links over here, and the highlighted portion which gets automatically highlighted, it's effectively the links to REST API. Now I'm not interested in activities, I'm not interested in comment, I'm interested in all the profiles whose title is Harry Potter. So it's effectively people's API. So I click on people's API and I see there are 3 different people API available. I can get a person if I know his G+ ID, or I can search people by a specific query, or I can list people based on the activity. It's a no-brainer to understand that we are now going to use the search API for this, and then this is how the request looks like. So it says that get https://googleapis.com, the API is plus, the version is v1, and the resource is people. Let's scroll down all the way to the bottom, and here is a try it editor. Every API that you try to access will have a try it editor in the bottom. You can try out the query if you write in Harry Potter. I will not do that because we have a couple of more interesting demos to finish. So if you write Harry Potter over here and if you just type in execute, you will be able to get say 10, 20, depending on how many max results you have filled in those number of profiles for Harry Potter. So that's how, any question you have for APIs related issues, this is the first location to land, and 99% will get answer to your question in sufficient details. Now it's not just possible to run from this one page to another if you want to look all the APIs at one shot. So for that, there is this another tool that is made available, which is an API Explorer, and API Explorer is an interactive tool that will help you to list all the APIs available on a single page. So for example, you have played through the developer's site and now you are kind of aware of all these APIs, and now you want to list all them in one site and probably play with them or just know what parameters are there, not necessarily the entire documentation and all that. You can do that using APIs Explorer. So APIs Explorer is a place where you can list all the APIs available for developers. You can explore their methods, you can explore the required parameters, you can list the actual API calls, try out the API calls, examine the HTTP response, and more interestingly, you can send authenticated request by faking a user and try out on the behalf of the user and try out how it looks like. So here is a simple exercise. We are going to talk about API. We are going to use API Explorer, and these are some simple things that can be done. For example, I can use API Explorer, create a short URL, or I can search for all public activities associated with Chennai, or I can list all files on my Google Drive. Before we jump to these exercises, let's have a look at how API Explorer looks like. So this is how API Explorer looks like. If you see, there is a list of all the APIs available at one place, along with the versions and along with all the information. So the first exercise was conversion of a short URL to a long URL. So let's go to the URL shortener API, which will be here. If I click it, I see all the possible methods available in the URL shortener API. So there is a get method, which expands a short URL or gets a creation time and analytics. There is an insert method which creates a new short URL given a long URL. And then there is a list method which will also tell you your history of what all URLs you have converted so far. So just take an example. We'll go to the insert because we want to convert a long URL to a short URL. And this is how now we can try it out. Please understand, in the previous example, there is a lot of documentation. Here there is no documentation, but on the top, if you can see, there is a link. This link points to the developers page where you can see all the documentation in details. This is the place with no theory, everything to try out. So as we saw earlier, this is a post request and it requires a body to this request. You don't need to remember all the parameters. You just click on the request body box. You can see what parameters are required. The only compulsory or mandatory parameter is long URL. So let's try that out. http://html5rocks.com, execute, 200 OK, it's a success, and this is U1GZZ. This is a short URL that was obtained. So this is how you can try out all different APIs. Let's go to one more example. The third one, list all files from your Google Drive. So if you're not aware, Google Drive is a place where you can, it's exactly like your Drive, but residing on the cloud, and it behaves exactly like you can drag documents to it and store files to it and access it. So let's see what all files are there on my Google Drive. So to start with, I'm going to go back to the API Explorer. I'm going to go to the Drive API. It's files over here. They require so many APIs over here. The required API to get the information would be drives.files.list, which will list all the files that are available on my drive. So I would go to drives.files.list, and there is nothing mandatory over here. I don't want to see only 10 or 15. I want to see everything, and I'm going to execute this. Unfortunately, this doesn't work. And it's obvious that this doesn't work because I'm just going on that page and executing, and I'm saying I want to see my files, and then there is no information about who I am. Doing a shortening of a URL is easy because it doesn't need your own authentication. But here, when I'm saying my files, I need to know who am I, and that's exactly what this API is saying. The error that it is returning, it says this method requires you to be authenticated, and then if you see the response is 401 unauthorized, and the error message clearly says that login is required. Now how do you try out this authentication? We'll go, in general this authentication and authorization is done using an international standard called OAuth 2, but we'll go in those details later on. Just now it's very easy to try it out just by one click. So it says you may need to activate the toggle above to authorize your request using OAuth 2. So this is only to try out things. So here is, if you see, here is that toggle which is currently off, and it's saying authorize request using OAuth 2. I'm clicking it on, and then it says please select an OAuth 2 scope. An OAuth 2 scope essentially tells the end user or tells the application what user data you are allowed to access. So for example, when I'm accessing Google Drive APIs, I can only access users' Google Drive data. I cannot access his Gmail or I cannot access his videos. So scope essentially tells what all user data the API access is limited to. So it's saying select your scopes. I'm going to just say authorize, and then it says now to me, the logged in user, it's showing that Google APIs Explorer is asking your permissions to do all these things in your absence or on your behalf. So this is the logged in user. You can see my name there on the top. So this is the logged in user to whom this screen will appear. This is a redirect screen. As you can see on the top, there is accounts.google.com. OAuth 2 redirect screen is there. It will always appear whichever application you write. This screen you always gets presented to the user. It will show the name of your application and it will say it's requesting a permission to do a couple of things. Now I'm going to allow the access over here. So I allow the access and now I execute this API and then it shows me a couple of files that I have on my drive. Okay, it's a JSON encoded entity, so it's easy to pass and go through. Cool, so let's move ahead to how to make Authenticator call. This was the previous slide where we talked about API Explorer. Let's go about how to make authenticated calls. So OAuth 2 is essentially a mechanism by which one application can access users' data which is residing on a different site by user permission. So OAuth 2 is an international standard. There is a link in the presentation that you can try out later on. And what does it do? Essentially, it allows the users to share their private resources, for example, photos or videos or emails stored on one site with other sites without requiring to give out his password. Let's have a very high level understanding of what are the steps involved in OAuth. On the next slide, we are going to talk about each step in detail because that's what you will have to do when you write your own applications. So the steps involved to use OAuth to access the user's data on a very high level. The first thing that you have to do is any application that you want users access users data with, you have to register on API console. API console is a single place where all the applications that use Google APIs need to be registered whether or not they access users data. So it's the place where you will manage your application, manage the traffic to it, do costing, manage quotas and all that. We'll talk about API explorers towards the end. So first step, you register your application using the API console. Second thing, as you saw a minute ago, you redirect the user to Google's authorization page. So redirect the browser to the Google's authorization page for a web app, and if it's an installed app, you typically send a web service request. That page is where user says, okay, I'm fine with this application accessing my private data, or I'm not okay with this application accessing my private data. So whatever is the information the user will be prompted for giving the permission, it will clearly say this data this application may use. And if the user says yes, the authorization server will send an access token back to your application, which you use for further API access. So just to quickly summarize, number one, you have to register your application, and once that is done, this is the flow, how it looks like. So you prompt or you request for a token to the Google server, which results in a redirection where the user is shown that screen where he says I agree or I disagree. And then if he agrees, then in the response, a token is returned. This token should be used for all the requests in future. So let's go in details. Please bear with me a little bit bigger slide. So step number one, I'm repeating this again and again because this is really important. If this gets in the head perfectly, it will be very easy for you to win Chromebooks. So register your application using API console and provide appropriate redirect URIs. What is a redirect URI? A redirect URI is a location where if the OAuth server, if the user says yes or no, the information, whatever is the result, along with the token gets redirected to. You want to specify redirect URI because, and you must specify redirect URI because the Google's authorization server must need to know that the request is coming from an authenticated place and the reply is going to an authenticated place. So you register your application with the API console and you give appropriate redirect URIs. As a result, you get a unique client ID and a client secret. Client ID is different than a token. Token is for a request basis. Client ID is specifically for your application. It will never change. As soon as you register your application with Google's API server, you get a client ID. Then you redirect the user, as we have already seen, to a special URL. This is the URL that you redirect to, accounts.google.com, OAuth to auth. This all information you can find once this presentation goes online. And you provide required parameters like what is your redirect URI, what is your client ID, and what is your scope. For example, this request says I want to access users calendar APIs. So the scope is related to calendar and a couple of other parameters. If the user agrees, the user is redirected to the specific redirect URI which you have already specified by passing something called as the authorization code. And of course, if the user disagrees, the redirect happens without the authorization code, but the redirect always happens. In the later case, it will happen with an error code. So this is what it looks like. If the user agrees, then a redirect will happen to your example.com/back. Observe that it's exactly the same redirect URI that you have passed over here, and an authorization code will be passed to you. The next step is very important. Authorization code is really useless for you. It's only an additional step to ensure that your application is correctly behaving. What you pass for the API request is actually a token, an access token. And therefore, in the next and the last step, once you obtain the authorization code, you exchange it to get an access token and a refresh token. So then you do a post request to this URL, pass all other stuff along with the code. This is exactly the code as you got in the previous page, and then in the response you get an access token and you get a refresh token. With this access token, now you can get all users, you can call APIs that require user specific data. Again, this access token will be used only for those scopes which you have mentioned earlier while getting the authorization code. So in this typical example, this access token will be used for getting the calendar specific data of the user. It expires in 3600 seconds. So typically access tokens are alive only for 1 hour, and there is no way to, except for using refresh token to refresh it, there is no way to just say that I want an access token which is alive for next year or something. User will be prompted again and again, and if you see on the previous page, there is something called approval prompt force, which means that even if there is a token which is alive, you reprompt the user. This is basically certain security additions. So let's, whatever I talked again was all theory. Let's actually play this step so that it gets permanently registered in the brain. So Google OAuth Playground is something where you can try out all these steps and find out how the authorization code gets exchanged and how access token and refresh token are obtained and so on. So the OAuth Playground is an interactive tool that helps you to understand the OAuth 2 protocol, learn steps to make an authenticated API call using the access tokens, what we discussed on the previous slide, and make authenticated API calls using a pre-registered application called OAuth 2 Playground. So you don't really need to create your own application and register it to understand how OAuth 2 works. There is a pre-registered application called Google OAuth 2 Playground that can be used to try out OAuth 2 Playground and examine the HTTP response. So we are going to do one of these exercises. So for example, let's say use the OAuth 2 Playground to find out how many unread mails you have in your Gmail inbox. So here is how OAuth 2 Playground looks like. Observe that on the left hand side there are all the APIs listed over here. To solve this exercise, I would like to have access to Gmail API. So let's take Gmail API and let's authorize. So when I say, look at on the right hand side what request it looks like, what request is showing. It prompts the screen because when I say authorize APIs, I have been redirected as a user. I have been redirected to the OAuth site where I am getting a message called OAuth 2 Playground is requesting a permission to do a couple of things. It's effectively view and manage my mails. So let me allow access over here. Okay, as soon as I get an access, what I get over here is now authorization code. It's not just something black box that is going on. On the right hand side, you can actually see what is the request and the response. So this was the request that was sent, and that was the this was the response that was received, and this was the request that was sent. So this is authorization code, and now as we have already discussed, I'm going to exchange the authorization code for tokens. So I exchange authorization code for tokens, pray that it works, cool. So there is a refresh token, there is an access token, and if you can see, is going to expire in 3600 seconds. So here is a refresh token, here is an access token, and now I can start using this access token for doing the actual request. So let's see what are the available request URIs. There are only 2 APIs currently available with Gmail. We'll be adding a couple of them soon. So there is a Gmail inbox feed and labeled in mail. So all unread mails, inbox feed only indicates unread mails. So all unread mails in my Gmail inbox and all labeled unread mails. So let's talk about this. Let's click this. It's a simple get request, so I don't have to do anything. Is there anything else I have to do? No. Send the request. HTTP 200 okay. The response is okay. And as you can see, there are a lot of unread mails in my inbox. Once, pardon? Yes, I did not add the token specifically. This OAuth 2 playground does it for you. Okay, one thing if you notice, this is not JSON. Okay, this is some XML encoded stuff. The reason why I showed you this is it shouldn't have a surprise, it shouldn't come as a surprise to you later on when you try to access Google APIs. Google APIs earlier, where all the APIs earlier were present on a platform called GData, where the resource exchange was being done using XML format. We have been consistently moving all the APIs to the REST-based platform, where the exchange is based on JSON resources. But this conversion is not yet complete, and therefore there will be some APIs that will be present on GData. There will be some APIs that will be present on REST framework. Yes. Yes. No, we are not. GData is the old version. We are not moving anything to GData. We are slowly moving away from GData to REST-based framework. But till we move it completely, yeah, his question was that are we moving everything to GData? So the answer is we are not moving everything to GData. We are moving everything away from GData. But till we have new support, for example, YouTube specific or Gmail specific APIs, till we have a complete support for REST-based request response, will not be removing or deprecating the GData based APIs. Switch on, switch on.
Can user disable the access to the particular application? Suppose some application uses my Gmail. I just as a user I don't want that application to use my.
Yes. So as a user you can see this access is only valid for 1 hour. Beyond 1 hour it goes off. Okay, you have to give the access again and again. There is no application where you just give an access and for next 5 years it will have the access.
Okay. Within 1 hour I cannot disable the.
I think there is a way. I'll find out and let you know. There is a way to disable it within 1 hour also, like if you give and within 5 minutes you want to disable, but by default it will stay for.
So suppose if I disable it, how the application will perform? What kind of error code I will get? Like
so the typical error code that you will get is that the resource is unavailable because unauthorized. Okay, that's what we see initially without giving me giving the permission. I tried to access my Google Drive, and then the error that I got was unauthorized. Right? Yes. Exactly that. Cool. So. Mike, again.
What is the significance of the token? Because like you have an authorization code and then you convert it to token. Why do I need to do that?
So authorization code is only an additional security check that you are coming only to a specific redirect URI, a specific URI that has been registered with Google.
That's what the authorization code is also doing, right?
I really don't know what is exact requirement, but as I understand, it's only an additional security check. I'll read it and find out.
Thanks.
Anything else, or shall I?
If I'm making a mobile, say, email reader or something, so you said that every 1 hour it will be deactivated, right? Every 1 hour the token will be deactivated, right? So every 1 hour I have to reauthorize it.
You have to reauthorize it, or you can use, there is something called as a refresh token. I'll just show you. There is something called as a refresh token over here.
Okay.
So if the user is okay with not reauthorizing every now and then, you can use the refresh token to refresh it. But this access token will expire in 1 hour. It cannot live beyond that.
Okay, I have 2 questions. First question is, if I have a request token, refresh token, can I? This refresh token is that it doesn't have any expiry time, right?
Refresh token will expire. Refresh token has to be used before the access token expires.
No, then what's the point? No,
One time. So if you use the refresh token, you will get a new pair of refresh token and access. Okay, so that you can use it.
No, I have a case where access token got expired, and I used to get new access token after I give the access token. And one more question is this access token machine dependent? Is it generated depending on the machine?
I have no answer to this question, but this access token is generated from the server and comes over here. So I don't know whether it's, you're saying client machine?
Yes.
I don't know. I don't think it's generated depending on machine, but depending on machine says depending on instance. For example, if you make a request and somebody else makes a request, it will be different access tokens. But it's not that once you get an access token, you can use it anywhere. You can of course use it anywhere, but you have to have that redirect URI. That is.
Actual use cases in Google Cloud Engine. If I generate access token and request token in one instance, I can use it on other instance, right? Is it possible?
Google Cloud Engine, I'll get you in touch with one person who will answer that question. Okay?
I have another question, sorry. Like you have this auto refresh the token before it expires. Is this applicable, is this applicable only to the playground or is it available for all applications?
It's available for all applications.
So what is the point? If I enable it, then it gets auto refreshed every
It's not auto refreshed, you have to take user's permission to use this.
There is a checkbox, right? Auto refresh the token before
Yes,
it expires. So each time the user is forced to click.
No, this is just a playground. In
Okay,
playground
so
we
that's
have
available only on the playground. It's
this
not
feature
available.
of auto refreshing is this box and all is available in the playground.
Okay, so for us to use it, it's not there. Not in the playground. If you want to use
I
this.
don't know those details, I'll find out.
Okay.
It's in my.
I like to share one thing regarding the OAuth.
Yeah,
What happened 2 months back, I created an application using OAuth. So in that application, when I created and registered my client app, the client app I called as let's say my task. You are creating an application called my task, which is fetching the task from the Google API. What I did is, using the OAuth concept, I authorized the app, and I once authorized, you will not get the prompt authorize this app again and again. Once authorized, it's all. That's all. You can start accessing the task using your own application, but after 1 hour, if you try to access the application, you will be redirected to the Google username password. Again, you will not be, the Google will not ask, please authorize this app. It will be asked only one time. So just for a clarification, the authorize this app will be displayed and prompted to the user only one time. After the token has been expired, you will redirect it to the Google username and password, where you need to type in the username and password, then directly it will redirect it to your own application. Thank you.
Okay, I appreciate all these questions and we'll take all these questions later on. Unfortunately, the time is up, so I want to tell you 2 important things before we stop. All this chaos of authorization token and access token and refresh token is not required if you are using client libraries. Client libraries, we handle that totally internally and they will not require you to do this to and fro exchange of authorization token, access token and all that. So client libraries are available in 9 different languages and it's very simple to securely call RESTful APIs, take care of error handling and all that without requiring the user to do all this stuff. Here is an example of a JavaScript client library where you can do a simple API key is the only thing that you set and you get an API key as soon as you register your application. So the only thing that you do is set an API key and then simply send a request and it will take care of all the authorization and all that on your behalf. This is a quick example of API library and let's within 2-3 minutes I will talk about AppScript. So AppScript is a cloud JavaScript engine where you can automate tasks across Google products or you can write your own custom spreadsheet functions or something like that. Let's do a small exercise, it will take 1 minute. Create a new document titled Hello World with some content in it. So how do I access the AppScript? I go to Google Drive, drive.google.com. Look at this, create more a script. This is how you create a new AppScript. Just close this dialog. So this is now an app script. Let's create say document app dot create my first doc. and let's say var x is equal to, and then x dot append paragraph my first line. Let's execute this, save and okay, some project name and execute. It doesn't execute so fast. It says again, because I am accessing my own drive and creating a document on the drive, it says that okay, this script requires your authorization and all that. Fair enough, I authorize. Now you can run the script, and if I run the script has still running. Okay, it's run successfully. Now I go to the drive and I say, see this, my first doc, which has my first line as in it. So not just that is a very simple thing, but oh, if you're clapping, I can show you 10 more things. No, kidding. But for example, you can write your own custom functions to spreadsheet, or you can write your own. You can send email programmatically. So for example, from here also, you can go to where tools and okay, so I think you can send custom emails by reading email addresses from spreadsheet cells and all that. So I think that's all what I had for today's session. Sorry for that electricity failure and all that. Otherwise, we would have done these things in sufficient details. But then come back to Bangalore and Hyderabad, and then we'll talk something more. So to wrap it all, developers.google.com, API Explorer, OAuth 2, OAuth 2 Playground. API console I didn't show you, but feel free to go and find out how to use API console. Client libraries I discussed, app script I discussed. And again, I don't want you to forget the basic gist of why this session exists. It's only because of Chromebooks and $20K things. Thanks a lot, and I hope to see applications developed by you all on Developer Showcase.